The Dark Scrolls. The story of Cleopatra begins not with the golden sands of Egypt or the majestic silhouette of the pyramids, but with a shock that unsettles one of history's most enduring myths. For centuries, the name Cleopatra has evoked images of the quintessential Egyptian queen, draped in linen, adorned with kohl-rimmed eyes, and reigning as the embodiment of the Nile's eternal spirit. Yet beneath that familiar image lies the first truth so startling that it rewrites the foundation of her legend. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, was not Egyptian at all. Her bloodline, rather than flowing from the native pharaohs who built empires upon the desert, traced its path back across the Mediterranean Sea to Macedonia. The dynasty that bore her name, the Ptolemies, were foreigners who seized Egypt after the campaigns of Alexander the Great. These rulers were Greeks in language, in culture, and in identity. For nearly 300 years they had perched on Egypt's throne like exotic birds, shimmering with imported plumage, but never blending into the land beneath their feet. Cleopatra was the descendant of this long line of outsiders, and yet, paradoxically, she would become the face of Egypt itself, the one ruler remembered above all others. To understand the shock of this revelation, imagine the Egypt Cleopatra inherited. By the time she was born in 69 BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty had endured centuries of turmoil. Successive generations of her ancestors had fought each other for power, married siblings in a desperate bid to preserve their line, and leaned heavily upon the wealth of Egypt to prop up their fading glory. The Nile Delta, once the cradle of the world's most stable civilization, was now ruled by a family of Greek monarchs who scarcely spoke the language of the common people. For the peasants who labored under the sun to grow wheat and papyrus, the name of their queen came from across the sea. They looked upward and saw palaces filled with Greek customs, Greek gods, and Greek politics. In this fractured landscape, Cleopatra emerged as a paradox, a foreigner by blood, yet destined to embody Egypt more fully than many native pharaohs before her. It is easy to imagine how this duality shaped her early years. Cleopatra was educated in Alexandria, the bustling metropolis that her ancestors had built as their capital. Alexandria was no ordinary city. It was a cosmopolitan wonder, the seat of the great library, a harbor where ships from every corner of the Mediterranean exchanged not only goods but also ideas. The young Cleopatra grew up surrounded by Greek tutors, philosophers, and mathematicians, inheriting the intellectual legacy of her ancestors. Yet, beyond the marble halls of her palace, she would have heard the rhythms of Egyptian life, the chants of priests in ancient temples, the cries of market sellers in a tongue foreign to her family, the eternal lapping of the Nile. Here lies the seed of the second shocking truth. Cleopatra would not remain a foreigner in spirit. Unlike the aloof rulers who preceded her, she sought to cross the invisible barrier between dynasty and people. She studied the Egyptian language, a gesture no Ptolemy had attempted before. This act alone transformed her from an alien monarch into a figure who could claim to stand with her people. It was not a superficial choice, but a calculated and daring one. For a ruler whose legitimacy always teetered on the edge, adopting the tongue of Egypt was a statement of belonging, a bridge across centuries of distance. But before that truth takes full form, we must return to the shock of the first. The queen, who is remembered as the last pharaoh of Egypt, was not of Egyptian blood. This paradox became the foundation of her legend. For centuries after her death, Cleopatra was romanticized as the ultimate Egyptian queen, yet in her veins ran the legacy of conquerors, not of pyramid builders. This revelation forces us to confront how history is crafted, not by bloodlines alone, but by the images rulers choose to weave around themselves. Cleopatra's genius lay precisely in this. Though foreign, She wrapped herself in the symbols of Egypt so completely that even now, more than 2,000 years later, we instinctively see her as the mother of that ancient land. Imagine the scene in Alexandria when Cleopatra first came of age. The city itself was a symbol of duality. Greek architecture blended with Egyptian temples, ships from Rome docked beside vessels from Nubia, and the streets hummed with dozens of languages. Within the palace, her family's Greek traditions persisted, banquets echoing with the poetry of Homer, courtiers discussing philosophy. Yet outside those walls, the great temple of Isis resounded with chants as old as the pyramids. Cleopatra would have walked between these worlds, feeling the tension of belonging to both and neither. Perhaps it was here, in this liminal space, that she understood the path she must take. For the people of Egypt, the Ptolemies were a distant presence. They saw their rulers not as gods incarnate, as they had once viewed the pharaohs, but as foreigners perched on borrowed thrones. Cleopatra recognized this fracture and chose to heal it, not with armies or decrees, but with language, ritual, and symbolism. She donned the dress of Egyptian queens, invoked the goddess Isis as her divine counterpart, and, crucially, spoke to her subjects in their own tongue. This simple act, revolutionary in its context, gave her a bond with the people that her ancestors had never achieved. But why does this matter? Why does it shock us still to discover that Cleopatra was not Egyptian? Because it reveals the fragility of identity itself. History often paints her as the last flower of Egypt's ancient civilization, yet in truth she was the product of cultural fusion, of foreign conquest, of adaptation. Her legend reminds us that identity is not fixed, but crafted, that a ruler may adopt symbols powerful enough to overwrite the truth of bloodlines. Cleopatra became Egyptian not by birth, but by choice, and that choice has echoed for millennia. This first truth also reframes her story when placed against the might of Rome. At the time of Cleopatra's reign, Rome was not merely a neighboring state, but a rising empire whose appetite seemed insatiable. Egypt's wealth, its fertile Nile, its grain, its strategic ports, was a prize Rome could not ignore. Cleopatra, born of a dynasty already weakened by internal strife, would face the full force of Roman ambition. And in this confrontation, her ability to embody Egypt itself became her greatest weapon. By cloaking herself in the identity of the pharaohs, she could claim to be more than a foreign queen. She was Egypt personified. As the story of Cleopatra unfolds, the layers of myth and truth intertwine. She was both Greek and Egyptian, both foreign and native, both conqueror and protector. This duality, shocking though it may be, laid the foundation for her political genius, her cultural resonance, and her enduring legacy. In the dim light of history, when we first glimpse Cleopatra, we must discard the Hollywood image of a woman draped in gold and instead see her as she truly was. A foreign queen who dared to reinvent herself as Egypt's own. This reinvention, bold and unprecedented, is the opening act of her story, and it sets the stage for the second truth, her mastery of language, her ability to weave bridges where none had existed. The revelation that Cleopatra was not Egyptian is not a diminishment of her legend, but an enhancement of it. It forces us to see her not as a passive figure carried by destiny, but as an active architect of her own identity. She chose Egypt, claimed Egypt, and in doing so became the Egypt remembered forever. And so, as we step deeper into her life, the myth begins to unravel and reweave. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood, but she became Egyptian in spirit, more so than many who came before her. This paradox, shocking in its simplicity, is the first thread in the tapestry of 7 truths that will redefine our understanding of the queen who defied Rome, captivated the world, and left behind a legacy still shrouded in mystery. If Cleopatra's foreign bloodline was the first shock, then her response to it was even more startling. Where her ancestors had kept their distance from Egypt's ancient soul, Cleopatra crossed the boundary. She became the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty to learn and speak the Egyptian language, and in doing so she transformed her reign from a fragile inheritance into a living connection with her people. To appreciate the weight of this act, one must understand the arrogance of her predecessors. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies sat upon Egypt's throne, yet they behaved like foreigners who had stumbled into a palace they never fully understood. They built their capital, Alexandria, in Greek style. They preserved their mother tongue, Greek, in the courts and the administration. They imported Greek customs, Greek scholars, Greek gods. The peasants who worked the fields spoke Egyptian, prayed in Egyptian, dreamed in Egyptian. Their rulers, meanwhile, remained deaf to them. This divide was not only cultural but symbolic. Language is identity. To refuse the tongue of your people is to declare that you are above them, apart from them. For the Ptolemies, this had been acceptable. Their power did not rest upon winning hearts, but upon the wealth of Egypt's harvests, the might of mercenary armies, and the legitimacy inherited from Alexander's conquest. But by Cleopatra's time, that world was crumbling. Rome's shadow grew longer with each passing year. Egypt could no longer afford rulers who were strangers in their own land. Cleopatra saw this truth with a clarity her ancestors lacked. She understood that if she was to survive, if Egypt was to stand at all, she would need more than armies and wealth. She would need legitimacy. She would need the hearts of her people. And so she did what no Ptolemy before her had dared. She embraced the Egyptian language. The decision was not without risk. Within the palace, Greek remained the language of nobility and power. To speak Egyptian might have been seen as lowering oneself, as indulging in the tongue of peasants. Yet Cleopatra recognized that power lay not in the approval of her Greek courtiers, but in the loyalty of her subjects. The temples, the villages, the farmers along the Nile, they were the lifeblood of the kingdom. To ignore them was to court ruin. To embrace them was to weave her reign into the very fabric of Egypt. Imagine the moment when Cleopatra first stood before her people, not as a distant monarch, but as a queen speaking in their own voice. The effect must have been electrifying. For generations, the pharaohs of old had been gods who spoke directly to their subjects. The Ptolemies had broken this tradition, retreating behind the barrier of language. Cleopatra restored it. She spoke the prayers of Isis, the decrees of governance, the rituals of festivals in words that resonated with her people's souls. She was not merely a ruler, she became a pharaoh in spirit. This mastery of language was more than symbolic. It gave Cleopatra tools her ancestors had never possessed. By speaking Egyptian, she could communicate directly with priests, whose authority was immense. Temples in Egypt were not merely religious centers. They were hubs of administration, education, and economic activity. To win the loyalty of the priesthood was to win the loyalty of the people. Cleopatra's ability to converse with them in their own tongue made her appear not as an outsider imposing her will, but as a daughter of Egypt seeking their counsel. It also allowed her to shape propaganda. Coins minted during her reign carried not only Greek inscriptions, but Egyptian imagery. Her portraits invoked Isis, the goddess of motherhood, fertility, and protection. Through language, she transformed her foreign lineage into an illusion of divine legitimacy. She was not merely Cleopatra, the Greek queen. She was Cleopatra Thea Philopator, Cleopatra, the goddess, beloved of her father. And in the temples, she was hailed as the living Isis, the incarnation of Egypt's eternal mother. One might ask, did the people truly believe this? Or was it a performance, a mask placed upon a foreign face? The answer lies in the resilience of her legend. For centuries after her death, Cleopatra was remembered not as a Greek conqueror's descendant, but as the last great pharaoh of Egypt. Myths endure because they are believed, and Cleopatra's myth was forged, word by word, in the Egyptian tongue. But her mastery of language went even further. Ancient writers recorded that she spoke not only Greek and Egyptian, but several other languages of the Mediterranean and Near East: Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and perhaps even the tongues of the Ethiopians and the Parthians. In an age when rulers relied on translators, Cleopatra needed none. She could negotiate, persuade, and charm without a barrier of words. To the Romans, this was both unsettling and captivating. To her people, it was divine. Here, then, is the second shocking truth. Cleopatra's power was not founded on beauty, as legend so often claims, but on intellect. She wielded language as others wielded swords. In every word she spoke in Egyptian, she stitched herself into the identity of the land. In every tongue she mastered, she expanded her reach across borders. Her reign was not built upon seduction, but upon communication, persuasion, and brilliance of mind. Consider her encounters with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony. The Romans who chronicled her life, men like Plutarch and Cassius Dio, often reduced her influence to the allure of her beauty. But beneath their words lies the unspoken reality. Cleopatra was formidable because she could converse as an equal. She could argue politics, philosophy, and strategy without needing an interpreter. Her voice carried not only the cadence of a queen, but the authority of someone who understood the complexities of many worlds. This command of language also reveals her foresight. Cleopatra must have known that Rome would judge her, that historians would dismiss her as a temptress rather than a tactician. By mastering languages, she left behind not only myths but evidence, coins, inscriptions, and temple reliefs that testify to her role as a deliberate architect of her identity. These artifacts remind us that the Cleopatra of legend, draped in mystery and allure, was also a scholar, a polyglot, a strategist who understood that words could conquer hearts as effectively as armies conquered lands. As we trace this thread through her reign, we see how it prepared her for the struggles ahead. Egypt under Cleopatra was not a passive kingdom awaiting its fate. It was a land rallied by a queen who had learned to speak its voice. And when Rome loomed with its insatiable hunger, this bond between queen and people became her strongest shield. Yet, this bond would be tested. Cleopatra's reign was not secure, and the world she navigated was treacherous. Her siblings, as was the Ptolemaic custom, were both her allies and her rivals. Civil war simmered within the palace. Rome's generals circled like vultures. To survive, Cleopatra would need more than language. She would need cunning, strategy, and ruthlessness. And so the stage shifts to the third shocking truth. Cleopatra was not merely a scholar, not merely a queen beloved of her people. She was a master of political survival, a woman who could scheme, charm, and if necessary, destroy to maintain her throne. But before we cross that threshold, let us pause to recognize the brilliance of her linguistic revolution. Cleopatra's choice to speak Egyptian was not a footnote. It was a turning point in history. It was the act that allowed her to embody Egypt itself, to turn her foreign blood into a legacy, indistinguishable from the Nile. In that moment, she ceased to be merely a descendant of conquerors, and became, in truth, the last pharaoh of Egypt. The irony is that without this act, her story might have been forgotten. Without the language of her people, she would have been just another fading monarch in a dynasty already crumbling. Instead, she transcended her bloodline. By mastering Egyptian, she claimed Egypt's ancient soul, and in doing so, she ensured her memory would outlast even Rome. Thus, the second shocking truth becomes clear. Cleopatra's genius was not beauty, but intellect, not seduction, but speech. She became the first of her dynasty to embrace the Egyptian language, and with it she reshaped the destiny of a kingdom. And as the horizon darkens with the approach of Roman ambition and internal strife, we move forward into the third revelation, the ruthless, calculating heart of a queen who would stop at nothing to survive. When we left Cleopatra, she had already transformed herself into the first Ptolemaic monarch to truly embrace the Egyptian tongue, weaving her identity into the very fabric of the land. Yet words alone could not preserve her throne. The Egypt she inherited was fractured, unstable, and surrounded by enemies. If she was to endure, she needed not only intelligence but also the ruthless instincts of a survivor. Cleopatra was not a passive queen remembered merely for her beauty, nor simply a scholar who mastered languages to bridge cultures. She was a master of political survival, calculating and formidable, moving through the dangerous web of dynastic rivalries and Roman ambitions with a precision that rivaled any ruler of her age. Her rise to power was anything but inevitable. Born into a dynasty notorious for its blood-soaked rivalries, Cleopatra's earliest years were shaped by the chaos of Ptolemaic politics. Brothers fought sisters, mothers conspired against daughters, and kings poisoned their kin to secure power. To be born into this family was to be thrown into a pit of vipers, where survival meant learning to strike first. Cleopatra's childhood was not a fairy tale of palaces and privilege. It was an education in suspicion, betrayal, and intrigue. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was weak and unpopular. Nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, he was more interested in music than in the art of rule. His reign was marked by bribery and dependence upon Rome, which drained Egypt's wealth and eroded its sovereignty. When he was exiled from Alexandria, Cleopatra was still a child, but the lesson was clear. In Egypt, thrones were precarious, and rulers survived only by cunning alliances. When Ptolemy XII returned to power with Roman backing, Cleopatra observed firsthand how foreign strength could decide the fate of Egypt. She understood early that Rome was not just a neighbor, but the arbiter of destiny. For a princess with ambitions, this was both terrifying and instructive. By the time of her father's death in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was about 18 years old. The will he left behind was typical of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It demanded that Cleopatra co-rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. To preserve their dynasty's purity, as was tradition, Cleopatra was expected to marry him. This arrangement might have seemed orderly on paper, but in reality it was the spark for civil war. Cleopatra was ambitious. She had the intelligence, the charisma, and now the linguistic connection to her people. But her younger brother's regents and advisors saw her as a threat to their power. Conflict was inevitable. Within a few short years, Cleopatra was forced into exile, driven from Alexandria by the factions loyal to her brother. For many rulers, exile would have been the end. For Cleopatra, it was the beginning. Here, her cunning shines brightest. Rather than fade into obscurity or wait helplessly for fortune to change, Cleopatra took destiny into her own hands. She knew that to reclaim her throne, she needed a powerful ally, and in the year 48 BCE, fate delivered one to her shores. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome. Caesar's arrival in Egypt was not for her sake, but for Rome's. He pursued Pompey, his great rival in civil war, who had fled to Alexandria. But when Pompey was murdered by Ptolemy, the 13th's advisors, Caesar found himself entangled in Egyptian politics. Cleopatra saw her chance. She understood that Caesar, though foreign, was the key to her survival. If she could win his support, she could not only reclaim her throne, but secure Egypt's independence against Rome's growing hunger. What followed is one of the most legendary episodes in history, Cleopatra's secret entrance into Caesar's presence. Ancient accounts, colored by myth and embellishment, tell us that she smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters, rolled inside a carpet or bundled in bedding, only to emerge as a living vision of charm, intellect, and determination. Whether literal or symbolic, the story captures the essence of her genius. Cleopatra did not wait for Caesar to summon her. She made herself impossible to ignore. This was not merely seduction, as Roman writers later implied. It was strategy. Cleopatra presented herself not as a supplicant, but as an equal, a queen fighting for her throne. She knew how to frame her plight, not as personal ambition, but as a struggle for stability in Egypt, stability that Rome, too, required. Caesar, pragmatic as always, saw the advantage in her survival. And so, with his backing, Cleopatra re-entered Alexandria not as an exile, but as a queen restored. The price of survival, however, was blood. Civil war erupted between Cleopatra's forces and those loyal to her brother. The Battle of the Nile in 47 BCE ended in victory for Cleopatra and Caesar. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the chaos of retreat, leaving Cleopatra secure upon her throne. But even then, survival demanded further sacrifice. Cleopatra married another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, in order to satisfy dynastic tradition, though the real power lay with her alone. Soon after, she bore Caesar's child, Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion. This was not romance in the modern sense. It was politics, the binding of Egypt's fate to Rome's through the living symbol of a child. Here we see Cleopatra's ruthlessness more clearly. To maintain power, she accepted marriages to her brothers, orchestrated their downfalls, and used her son as a living testament to her alliance with Caesar. When Ptolemy XIV mysteriously died a few years later, possibly poisoned, Cleopatra raised Caesarion as co-ruler. The message was unmistakable. The dynasty of Egypt was tied to the greatest man in Rome. For many, these choices might appear cruel, even monstrous. But in the world Cleopatra inhabited, ruthlessness was not a vice but a necessity. Survival demanded that she eliminate rivals, secure alliances, and bend tradition to her will. She could not afford to be sentimental, nor could she trust in the loyalty of blood. Her family was her greatest threat, her throne a battlefield. To hesitate was to die. Her cunning extended beyond Egypt's borders. Cleopatra understood the fragile balance of Rome's politics. Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE shattered that balance, plunging Rome into another cycle of civil war. Once again, Cleopatra adapted. She aligned herself with Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted general and one of the most powerful men in Rome. Their relationship has been romanticized for centuries, cast as a love affair that shook empires. But beneath the passion was strategy. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection. Antony needed Egypt's wealth. Their union was both personal and political, a merging of interests as much as hearts. With Antony, Cleopatra expanded her ambitions. She envisioned an Eastern empire, independent of Rome, with Alexandria as its jewel. Together, they declared Caesarion the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar, a claim that threatened the very heart of Rome's political order. It was a dangerous gamble, and Cleopatra knew it. But her ambition was never timid. She believed Egypt could stand not as a vassal, but as a partner equal to Rome. This gamble, of course, would eventually lead to tragedy. Rome would not tolerate rivals. The union of Antony and Cleopatra provoked Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who would rise as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. The confrontation was inevitable. Yet even as her fate drew toward its dramatic conclusion, Cleopatra's cunning never waned. She raised fleets, commanded armies, and negotiated tirelessly. In her final days, when defeat loomed and Antony fell upon his sword, she still fought to secure Egypt's future. Some accounts suggest she sought to negotiate directly with Octavian, offering herself as a queen of Rome. Others hint that she considered passing power to Caesarion alone. Every move she made was calculated, every choice an attempt to preserve something from the jaws of conquest. Here lies the essence of the third shocking truth. Cleopatra was not a tragic victim swept away by history, nor a temptress who bewitched powerful men. She was a strategist of the highest order, navigating one of the most dangerous political landscapes in history. She allied with Caesar when it suited her survival. She allied with Antony when Rome fractured again. She sacrificed siblings, courted gods, and wielded her son as a symbol. Every decision was driven by the same relentless instinct: to survive, to preserve Egypt, to carve a place for her dynasty in a world ruled by Rome. To judge her ruthlessness by modern standards is to miss the point. In her world, survival itself was a triumph. Where so many of her kin perished in obscurity, Cleopatra endured. Ruling for over 2 decades, she became not just the last queen of Egypt, but its most famous. And she did so not because of chance or beauty, but because she mastered the art of survival. As the curtain falls on this act of her story, we are left with the image of a queen who was both brilliant and merciless. Cleopatra spoke with the tongue of her people, charmed the greatest leaders of her age, and wielded power with unflinching resolve. She was not Egyptian by blood, but she became Egypt in spirit. She was not merely a woman of allure, but a ruler who outwitted men who sought to dominate her. And yet, for all her cunning, fate would not be denied. Rome's might was relentless, and in the end her survival would be tested one final time. Which brings us to the fourth shocking truth: the mystery of her death, a tale long believed to involve a serpent's bite, but far more complex than the legend suggests. Cleopatra's story, already filled with paradox and survival, turns darker as it approaches its most dramatic and mysterious chapter. She had navigated through treachery, exile, civil war, and alliances with Rome's most powerful men, yet in the end even her extraordinary cunning could not shield her from the crushing weight of empire. The fall of Alexandria and the death of her great love, Mark Antony, pushed Cleopatra into the final act of her life, one that has been told and retold for 2,000 years. For centuries, the image has endured of a queen lying gracefully in her chamber, a serpent at her breast, the venom of an asp carrying her from the world with tragic dignity. But history is seldom so neat, and here lies the fourth shocking truth. Cleopatra's death was almost certainly not as legend describes, and the circumstances surrounding it reveal far more about power, propaganda, and the ruthless efficiency of Rome than they do about snakes and romance. The seeds of this ending were sown at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, when Cleopatra and Antony confronted Octavian, the future Augustus. It was more than a clash of armies, it was the collision of visions. Cleopatra and Antony dreamed of an Eastern empire with Alexandria at its heart, independent of Rome's suffocating grasp. Octavian dreamed of sole dominion, a Roman world unified under his control. The battle was brutal and decisive. As their fleets faltered and morale collapsed, Cleopatra's ships retreated, Antony followed, and their cause crumbled. For Octavian, it was the triumph he needed. For Cleopatra, it was the beginning of the end. When Octavian's forces marched into Egypt, Antony's strength failed him. Shattered by betrayal and loss, he fell upon his sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms. The image is romantic, but the reality was far bleaker. Antony's body broken, Cleopatra confronted not only personal grief but also the terrifying reality of Rome's imminent conquest. She was now alone, facing Octavian, a man she knew could not be swayed by beauty or alliances. He was young, ambitious, and cold. For Cleopatra, the challenge was no longer survival for herself, but survival for her legacy, her children, and the future of Egypt. It is here that the story becomes clouded in legend. Roman historians, eager to glorify Octavian and diminish Cleopatra, shaped the narrative of her death. They painted her as a tragic seductress who chose suicide by snakebite rather than humiliation at a Roman triumph. The image served Rome well. It made Cleopatra a cautionary tale, a woman undone by passion, a foreign queen destroyed by her own excess. But beneath the poetry of propaganda, the truth whispers something different. The logistics of the famous ASP make little sense. To smuggle a deadly snake into a heavily guarded chamber would have been no small feat. Even if she managed it, the asp's venomous bite was not a quick or guaranteed death. Some serpents required multiple bites to deliver a fatal dose. The process could take hours, even days, filled with agony rather than grace. Ancient sources themselves are inconsistent. Some suggest a snake, others speak of poison concealed in ointments or sharp hairpins laced with toxins. Some even imply that Octavian himself may have arranged her death, allowing suicide to become a palatable cover story. Modern scholars tend to doubt the snake altogether. Far more likely is that Cleopatra used a fast-acting poison prepared by her physicians, perhaps hemlock or a combination of deadly herbs. She had long studied pharmacology. Egypt's priests and healers were masters of toxins and antidotes. If anyone in the ancient world could orchestrate a death on her own terms, it was Cleopatra. By choosing poison, she ensured her final act was controlled, dignified, and free from Octavian's grasp. But why choose death at all? Cleopatra was not a woman who surrendered easily. She had outwitted enemies for decades, survived exile and civil war, and bent Rome's greatest generals to her will. Surely she could have attempted negotiation with Octavian. Indeed, some sources suggest she tried. She met him after Antony's death, reportedly dazzling even this hard-eyed conqueror with her intellect and presence. She may have hoped to secure her throne, or at least protect her children. Yet Octavian's ambitions were clear. He wanted Egypt, not Cleopatra. He intended to parade her as a trophy in his triumph through Rome, a spectacle of Rome's victory over the East. For Cleopatra, the humiliation of being displayed in chains was unthinkable. Better to die as a queen than live as a captive. Thus her final act was not weakness but defiance. In choosing death, Cleopatra denied Octavian his spectacle. She robbed him of the image of a broken queen, dragged through the streets of Rome. Instead, she sealed her story in mystery, leaving behind a legend powerful enough to eclipse Octavian's propaganda. He won Egypt, but she won eternity. Her death also shielded her children, at least temporarily. Though Octavian executed Caesarion, the son she bore with Caesar, her children by Antony were spared, raised in Rome under the guardianship of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife. Cleopatra's gamble may have been that by removing herself, she reduced Octavian's incentive for cruelty. In this sense, her death was not only an act of personal pride, but also of maternal strategy. The serpent legend endures because it is dramatic, but the truth is more poignant. Cleopatra likely orchestrated her death with calm precision, using knowledge and foresight rather than relying on myth. She did not passively accept fate, but crafted it, ensuring her final moment reflected the same control that had defined her life. This is the fourth shocking truth. Cleopatra's death was not a romantic accident of passion, but a deliberate act of defiance, shrouded in layers of propaganda to serve Rome's story. Consider how Octavian spun the tale. By promoting the idea of the snake, he reinforced the image of Cleopatra as exotic, dangerous, and otherworldly. She became less a political rival and more a symbol of decadent Eastern luxury brought low by Roman virtue. This was propaganda at its most effective. Cleopatra's complexities, her intellect, her linguistic mastery, her strategic brilliance were erased. What remained was a seductive queen undone by her own nature. Rome controlled not only her kingdom but her memory. Yet even here, Cleopatra outlived Octavian's intentions. Over time, the legend of the Asp took on a life of its own, transforming her into a tragic heroine admired for her courage. Artists, playwrights, and poets reshaped her image, from Shakespeare to Hollywood, painting her as the embodiment of love, defiance, and majesty. The truth of poison and politics may have been obscured, but Cleopatra herself became immortal, her myth far larger than the man who conquered her. In the stillness of that final chamber in Alexandria, Cleopatra achieved the last of her reinventions. She who had been born a Greek foreigner became the eternal queen of Egypt. She who had wielded language, strategy, and ruthlessness chose silence as her ultimate weapon. She denied Rome the narrative it craved and wrote her own ending instead. Even Octavian, triumphant though he was, seemed uneasy. When news of her death reached him, he was said to have been shaken. He had hoped to display her as proof of Rome's dominance, but she had slipped beyond his grasp. In death, she defeated him more thoroughly than she ever could in life. The mystery of Cleopatra's death lingers because it was more than a moment of mortality. It was a final assertion of power. Legends of serpents, poisoned pins, or secret brews are less important than the truth they obscure. Cleopatra died not as a victim, but as a queen who refused to be diminished. This choice marks the climax of her story, but not its end, for her legacy would ripple far beyond that chamber, shaping not only how history remembered her, but how empires defined themselves. And so, as her body was laid to rest beside Antony, Alexandria mourned, Egypt fell, and Rome absorbed the jewel of the Nile. Yet even in defeat, Cleopatra's legend refused to bow. Her death, veiled in mystery, was not a surrender but a final act of resistance. She left behind not the humiliation Octavian intended, but the eternal question of how exactly she chose her fate. That question itself became her power, ensuring that 2,000 years later, the world still speaks her name in awe. This is the haunting truth of Cleopatra's final chapter. The asp may never have coiled at her breast, but the myth coils still in the imagination of history, whispering of a queen who turned even her death into an act of defiance. Cleopatra's death might have sealed the fate of Egypt as a Roman province, but her story did not end with the silence of her tomb. What remained was not just myth and rumor, but the resonance of a queen who had wielded power in ways few rulers of her age could match. To understand her legacy, we must confront the last three truths that strip away layers of legend to reveal the real Cleopatra. Beyond her identity, her languages, and her political cunning, she was also an economic powerhouse, a ruler who commanded wealth that both sustained Egypt and enticed Rome. She was not the unparalleled beauty Rome later portrayed, but rather a woman whose true allure came from her mind and presence. And perhaps most enduring of all, her influence did not perish with her. It shaped empires, inspired generations, and secured her a place among the immortals of history. The Egypt Cleopatra ruled was not merely a land of monuments and myth. It was the breadbasket of the ancient world. The Nile's fertile floodplains produced grain on a scale unmatched by most regions of the Mediterranean, and Cleopatra understood the weight of this advantage. In an age when Rome's teeming population relied on imported food to survive, control of Egyptian wheat meant leverage over the very heart of the empire. Cleopatra grasped this with acute clarity. Her ability to provide or withhold grain from Rome gave her a bargaining chip that no Roman general could ignore. When famine loomed, Egypt's harvest could stabilize or destabilize entire regions. This was not mere luck of geography, but a resource Cleopatra wielded deliberately. She invested in the irrigation systems, ensured the priesthood and bureaucracy maintained order in the countryside, and even when wars drained her treasury, she preserved the essential machinery of Egypt's agricultural wealth. But grain was only part of the story. Egypt was also the source of papyrus, the lifeblood of administration, knowledge, and commerce throughout the Mediterranean. It controlled trade routes along the Red Sea that linked the Roman world with Arabia and India. Ivory, spices, glass, perfumes, and precious stones all flowed through Cleopatra's ports. She commanded a treasury that dazzled Rome and a network of resources that elevated Egypt far beyond a mere province awaiting conquest. The wealth of Egypt made it worth fighting for, worth dying for, and ultimately worth conquering. Cleopatra was well aware that her fortune was both shield and target. She used it not only to fund her armies and fleets, but also to secure alliances, reward loyalty, and project power. When she entertained Caesar in Alexandria or Antony in her floating palace on the Nile, it was not decadence for its own sake, but theater designed to remind them that she commanded the riches of a kingdom, unlike any other. This mastery of economics is the fifth shocking truth about Cleopatra. Her throne was not gilded only by myth, but by tangible wealth that could tip the balance of Mediterranean power. Yet, for all her economic might, the world remembers Cleopatra most vividly for her beauty. The image of the irresistible queen who seduced Caesar and Antony has dominated popular imagination for centuries. But the truth, as revealed by ancient coins and accounts, is more complex and perhaps more surprising. The surviving portraits minted during her reign depict a woman with a prominent nose, a strong jaw, and features far from the idealized softness we might expect. Roman writers, often hostile, described her not as surpassingly beautiful, but as captivating in presence. Plutarch wrote that her charm lay not in her looks alone, but in her voice, her intellect, and her ability to make herself irresistible through wit and conversation. Cleopatra's allure was not a passive gift of nature, but an active force she cultivated. She understood the art of charisma, the power of presence, and the influence of making every listener feel as though they were the center of her world. This sixth truth, that Cleopatra's magnetism was not about conventional beauty, but about charisma, intellect, and mastery of self-presentation, shatters one of history's most enduring stereotypes. She was not a Helen of Troy, defined by looks alone, but something far more formidable. A woman who could outthink and outmaneuver the most powerful men of her time by commanding the full force of her personality. In an era when women were so often reduced to pawns in dynastic games, Cleopatra turned her perceived weakness into strength. She let Rome believe her power lay in seduction, when in reality it lay in persuasion, calculation, and vision. Her beauty was the mask, her mind was the weapon. And then there is the final, most haunting truth. Cleopatra's influence did not die with her. Octavian sought to erase her, to transform her into a cautionary tale of a decadent foreign queen brought low by Rome's virtue. He succeeded in conquering her land, but he failed in conquering her legacy. Cleopatra became larger in death than she had been in life. Poets like Horace and Virgil, even as they echoed Rome's propaganda, could not resist portraying her as a figure of grandeur. Centuries later, she would inspire Shakespeare, who gave her words that still echo. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Artists, painters, and filmmakers across millennia have returned to her story, reshaping her image to fit their times, but never letting her memory fade. Her influence extended beyond myth. By binding her fate to Rome through Caesar and Antony, she altered the course of Roman history itself. Her union with Caesar produced Caesarion, whose existence unsettled Octavian and forced him to solidify his claim to power. Her wealth allowed Antony to challenge Rome in the East, precipitating the wars that ended the Republic and gave birth to the empire. Without Cleopatra, Augustus might never have risen as he did. Egypt's fall marked the final victory of Rome, but it also revealed how deeply Cleopatra had forced Rome to reckon with her presence. In this sense, her legacy is paradoxical. Though she lost her kingdom, she shaped the empire that replaced it. Beyond politics, Cleopatra's enduring power lies in her ability to fascinate. She has become a mirror for every age that gazes upon her. To Renaissance artists, she was the embodiment of tragic beauty. To Enlightenment thinkers, she was proof of the perils of passion over reason. To modern feminists, she is a symbol of female power in a world dominated by men. Her image has shifted and evolved, but her presence has never dimmed. Few figures in history command such eternal intrigue. This is the seventh and final truth. Cleopatra's legacy, born of cunning, intellect, and defiance, transcended her own time and became eternal, a story too powerful for even Rome to silence. And so, when we step back from the legends, what do we see? We see a queen who was not Egyptian by blood, but chose to become Egyptian in spirit. A ruler who spoke the language of her people and many others, weaving alliances with words as deftly as generals wielded swords. A survivor who navigated treachery, exile, and civil war with ruthless precision. A woman who faced Rome at its height and denied it victory in death by choosing her own end. An economic strategist who commanded the wealth of the Nile. A presence whose magnetism was born not of beauty but of intellect and charisma. And finally, a legend whose influence outlasted empires, echoing across centuries as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Cleopatra was more than the last queen of Egypt. She was a master of identity, a living paradox who turned weakness into strength and defeat into immortality. Her life was a dance with survival, her death a final act of defiance, her legacy a tapestry of myth and truth, woven so tightly that even now it is hard to separate them. She remains one of history's greatest enigmas, a woman who refused to be defined by others and who, in the end, defined herself. That is why, 2,000 years later, the world still whispers her name with awe. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.